It was the summer of 1998, and the heat seemed to never leave Ashland, a small, quiet town in rural Ohio. People left their windows open at night, confident that nothing bad could happen there. It was the kind of place where everyone greeted each other at the grocery store, where doors were rarely locked and where every face was too familiar to hide secrets. But that July night, something changed. The air was heavy, different, as if the town itself had held its breath. Megan Carter left the hospital around 11, exhausted after a 12-hour shift. She started her car, put her bag in the passenger seat, and drove down Highway 17, a route she knew inside out. 3 miles later, her car was found parked on the shoulder, the engine still warm, the headlights on, and the driver's door open. No sign of a struggle, no sound, just the wind dragging dry leaves across the asphalt. The police arrived in less than an hour, but the scene seemed too confusing to be real. The car radio was still on, the sound hissing softly. A sandal had fallen near the door and Megan's nurse's badge was hanging from the rearview mirror. One of the officers swore he heard a sound coming from the woods, like light footsteps, but when he shined his flashlight, there was only darkness and the distant rumble of a train. Megan's father showed up the next morning, his gaze lost, unsure how the daughter he'd seen leave for work had simply disappeared. He said she never drove that road alone at night, that she was afraid of the dark and avoided driving late. The locals began to whisper. Some said she might have run off with someone. Others spoke of a strange man they'd seen near the hospital days before. But nothing made sense. The whole town seemed to want to believe it was nothing serious, that she'd return soon, but the hours turned into days, and the days began to drag on with the weight of silence. No clues, no phone calls, nothing. The local sheriff promised he'd find answers, but deep down everyone knew this kind of thing didn't happen in Ashland, or at least that's what everyone thought, until something far away began to show that Megan's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. Stories like Megan's move us in a way that's hard to explain, right? It's that kind of mystery that sticks in your mind, that makes your heart beat faster and leaves a knot in your stomach, just imagining what happened on that dark road. Those who feel this understand, because it's not just curiosity, it's empathy. It's that impulse to want the truth to come out, to hope that somehow there will be closure, a reunion, justice. Here, each story is told with the weight it deserves, without sugarcoating, without easy cuts, showing the human side behind the crime and the cold that remains when the truth is still hidden. So come be part of this community of those who truly feel, who thrill with each discovery and get goosebumps with each twist. Press the subscribe and leaves the like now, because there are still many stories that need and deserve to be told as they really happened. Megan Carter was always the kind of person who went unnoticed but left a mark. An only child, raised in a simple house on the outskirts of Ashland, she grew up surrounded by silence, the same silence that now seemed to echo through the town since her disappearance. Her mother had died when Megan was just 10, and her father, a war veteran, was never the same after that. He drank to try to forget, and Megan, still a girl, learned to be the foundation of the house, to cook, to care, to understand his silences. She was a quiet, introspective girl, but she had a sensitivity that was disturbing. She always said she could sense when something bad was about to happen, and perhaps that's why, in the days before her disappearance, something in her outlook had already changed. At the hospital where she worked as a nurse, Megan was beloved by everyone, not just for her professionalism, but for a kind of kindness that seemed rare. She was the kind of person who knew every patient's name, who held the hand of those who were alone, and who remembered small details. However, there was a side of Megan that almost no one knew about, an old, almost irrational fear of closed, dark places. Since childhood, she avoided basements, windowless rooms, and long hallways. Her father said it was just her imagination, but Megan dreamed night after night of the same scenario, a door closing behind her, and darkness taking over. Maybe it was just coincidence, maybe it was a warning. She lived in a small apartment downtown, just minutes from the hospital. Her routine was always the same. Night shifts, strong coffee, the radio on low, and the drive back along Route 17, a route she took almost automatically. Friends said she planned to move to Boston at the end of the year, where she had been accepted into a specialization program. It was the kind of plan that held hope, and now seemed frozen in time, waiting for an explanation. That week, however, something strange happened. Megan told a colleague that she felt she was being watched. She said that sometimes, when leaving the hospital in the middle of the night, she thought she saw a car parked across the street, headlights off, engine running. She could never identify who was there. When her colleague suggested calling the police, she laughed. "It must be paranoia caused by fatigue," she replied, trying to hide her discomfort. But the truth was, she hadn't slept well in days. The nights seemed to grow longer and longer, and there was something in the air, a kind of quiet unease, as if something were lurking. On one of her last shifts, an elderly patient told her that the hospital was full of bad people. Megan smiled politely, but the comment lingered in her head. The elevator, which used to creak only from age, now made sounds that seemed deeper, almost human. One night, while going to the storage room to get supplies, she heard a metallic sound behind the shelves. She thought it was a mouse until she realized the boxes had moved on their own. She dropped off the supplies and hurried out, trying to control her racing heart. She didn't tell anyone. The Friday before her disappearance, Megan was last seen by a co-worker named Denise, who worked in the same department. They had coffee together before the end of their shift, and Megan seemed distracted, checking her watch frequently. Denise asked if everything was, okay, and Megan simply replied, "I feel like something bad is going to happen." Denise thought it was fatigue, maybe anxiety. After all, Megan had been working too much. But there was something different in her tone, a firmness that seemed to come from a deeper place, almost as if she knew something she couldn't explain. That night, when he picked up the car from the parking lot, the security guard noticed something curious. Megan's vehicle was parked next to an old truck covered in dust. He swore he'd never seen that truck before. He later said that while locking the gate, he saw the truck's headlights come on for a second and then go out. He thought it was a reflection, but the next day, the vehicle was gone. This detail would only become important days later, when they began to piece things together. Megan drove along Highway 17, listening to an old cassette tape she always kept in the car. It was her mother's voice, recorded when she was still a child, reading a bedtime story. That recording was her way of feeling less alone in the wee hours. The soft sound of her mother's voice contrasted with the emptiness of the road. Just before disappearing, she turned on her hazard lights and pulled over to the shoulder. No one knows why. Maybe she saw something. Maybe someone appeared in the middle of the road. The dashboard clock stopped at exactly 11:47 p.m. The next morning, the car was found. Megan's father immediately recognized his daughter's purse on the passenger seat, her name tag hanging from it, her sandals lying on the floor. He touched the seat and felt the heat still trapped in the fabric. "She was here," he said, his voice breaking. Police searched the area. Sniffer dogs scoured every inch of the surrounding field, but nothing. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, not a drop of blood. The disappearance seemed too clean, almost as if someone knew exactly what they were doing. Local newspapers ran the headline, "Young Nurse Disappears on Ashland Road." At first, everyone believed it was just another isolated incident. But what no one knew was that 2 years earlier, another young woman of the same age, also a nurse, had disappeared in a similar manner, and that this coincidence would soon become the first piece of a puzzle no one wanted to see. As the town struggled to return to its normal routine, Megan's father began posting posters on his own, wandering from bar to bar, store to store, asking for information. Some residents began to avoid him, unable to face the desperation in his eyes. He claimed to dream about his daughter, to see her calling for help, and even those who didn't believe in dreams had trouble sleeping soundly after hearing that. Ashland was beginning to sense that something deeper, darker was behind the disappearance, and although authorities insisted it pointed to a voluntary escape, there was something about the story that didn't add up, something no one wanted to admit, but which would soon become impossible to ignore. In the following days, the heat increased, and the smell of dry grass permeated the streets. The atmosphere felt heavy, suffocating. Megan was still missing, and residents began locking their doors for the first time in decades. At night, the news broadcasts repeated the same images. The car, the road, the field, always the same silence after the questions. What happened to Megan Carter? Where did she go? And most importantly, who else knew what really happened on that road on that sultry July night? Because someone did. Someone always knows. 3 days after Megan's disappearance, the mood in Ashland had changed. The intense heat was still the same, but the air felt thicker, almost difficult to breathe. People avoided talking about it, as if saying her name aloud might bring something bad. The car was still impounded in the police station yard, intact, like a mystery capsule no one could decipher. But that morning, something happened. A neighbor called the police saying he'd heard screams coming from an abandoned warehouse behind the old paper mill, a few miles from where the car had been found. The officers went there, but there was no one there, just a cut rope on the concrete floor and deep nail marks on the wooden wall. One of the officers commented that it looked more like a scene from a movie than real life. Another replied that sometimes real life is much worse. The news spread quickly, and with it, theories began. Some said Megan was alive and trying to escape. Others believed someone was playing on the town's desperation. Only one person didn't think it was a coincidence: Detective Laura Bennett. She arrived at the scene in the early afternoon, calmly observing every detail. She was 36 years old, with a face lined with dark circles and a gaze that seemed to see more than she should. She was new to Ashland, transferred from Columbus after a case that ended badly. Laura didn't believe in coincidences, much less in disappearances that were too clean. When she saw the cut rope, she bent down, ran her finger along the floor, and noticed something the others missed: small chips of white paint mixed with the dust. She looked up at the ceiling and noticed that the shed, though abandoned, had a freshly painted section. Someone had been there recently. Back at the police station, Laura reviewed Megan's missing person report, and a name caught her eye: Rachel Moore. 2 years earlier, Rachel, also a nurse, also from Ashland, disappeared after finishing a night shift at the same hospital. The case was never solved, filed under self-absenteeism. Laura opened the photos from the old case and felt a chill. Rachel's car had also been found on Route 17, and in both cases the radio was still on, as if the two had been interrupted in the middle of something trivial. The coincidence was striking, but no one seemed to have noticed. That night, Laura sat alone in her office, surrounded by reports, notes, and stacks of paper. The clock seemed louder than usual. She began drawing lines on a whiteboard. Megan, Rachel, hospital, Route 17, abandoned factory. Everything connected, but there was one missing piece. What kept those two women tied to the same spot on the map? She took out the city map and marked the locations related to each case with a red pen. When she connected the dots, she realized they formed a circular path, centered precisely at St. Mary's Hospital, the same one where they both worked. Her blood ran cold. Laura knew it. Couldn't be ignored. But she also knew her boss, Sheriff Douglas, didn't want a scandal. The next morning, she came to him with the evidence in hand. He looked at the notes, sighed, and said dismissively, "Ashland's too small for that kind of story, Bennett. These girls disappear on their own. It happens all the time." Laura kept his gaze steady. "With the car engine still warm and the radio on?" she retorted. Douglas looked away, pretending not to hear. "The case is closed, Detective. Go home." It was at that moment that Laura understood what she was up against. The system didn't want the truth, it wanted peace. And in that town, silence seemed more valuable than justice. Leaving the room, she walked down the hallway and felt the curious gaze of her colleagues. She knew they were whispering behind her back. The new one is already seeing ghosts. But she didn't care. Something inside her told her she was on the right path, that Megan and Rachel weren't the only ones. And if she was, right, someone there in Ashland carried a secret big enough to kill for. Back at the warehouse scene, Laura examined the ground again. The yellow tape was still there, flapping in the wind. She walked the perimeter and noticed something strange: small, faded footprints leading to a drainage pit covered by old planks. She lifted one of them and smelled a strong smell of damp and rust. Her flashlight illuminated something that looked like white fabric stuck between the stones. When she pulled it out, it was a piece of hospital scrubs. The initials on the pocket confirmed it: MC Megan Carter. Laura's heart raced. She photographed everything, bagged the tissue, and called the state lab. But once again, the report disappeared before it could be filed. The sheriff claimed the sample was not relevant. It was as if someone inside the station itself was covering their tracks. That night, alone in the car, Laura glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights behind her. The same pattern. Megan had described to a friend days earlier. 2 steady headlights, distant but steady. She accelerated, and they sped along. They only stopped when she pulled into the hospital parking lot. Sitting behind the wheel, breathing deeply, she realized she was involved in something bigger than she'd imagined, and for the first time she felt fear, not of what she might find, but of what was already there, hidden beneath the calm, everyday life of Ashland. It was as if each new clue wasn't leading her to the truth, but rather pulling her deeper into a labyrinth someone had carefully constructed. And right at the center of this maze, she began to see a shadow, a constant presence that seemed always one step ahead, the kind of presence that watches, that waits, that knows exactly what it's doing. And Laura didn't know it yet, but someone was already watching her every move, the same way they'd watched Megan before she disappeared. Laura spent that night awake. The clock read 3:30 in the morning while she was still sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, photos, and notes, scattered like a map of the chaos. The lamp cast a dim light, and the distant sound of a train pierced the silence, bringing back the same unease she'd felt since day one. She'd seen cases ignored before, but never something so blatant. Sheriff Douglas had made it clear he didn't want any noise. He wanted Ashland to remain the quiet town that sold the illusion of safety, the same town that left its gates open and believed monsters didn't exist. Laura knew that behind this kind of silence there was always something rotten, and the feeling of fighting alone began to grow like a knot in her stomach. The next morning, she returned to the police station determined to officially report the new find, the fragment of Megan's uniform. But the envelope was gone. No one knew where it was. No one had seen anything. The officer who had helped her collect it swore he'd left it on the sheriff's desk. Douglas, for his part, said it might have been a filing error. It was the kind of excuse Laura was tired of hearing. When she looked into his eyes, she saw more than carelessness. She saw fear, a contained fear, disguised by authority, and that ignited something inside her. It wasn't just disinterest, it was protectiveness. Someone, within the police force itself, was trying to bury the case. The following days were tense. The sheriff began leaving her out of meetings. Her colleagues whispered as she passed. Some looked at her with pity, others with irritation. The town, for its part, seemed satisfied with the official explanation. Megan had run away, perhaps tired, perhaps involved with someone. The local press repeated the same narrative, as if the disappearance were merely a personal drama, not a possible crime. Laura felt like screaming, but held back. She knew screaming was useless. She knew that sometimes silence was the only way to keep hearing what others were trying to hide. One rainy afternoon, she went to St. Mary's Hospital to review employee files. The administrator tried to stop her from entering, saying the investigation had been closed. Laura smirked and showed her badge, ignoring the resistance. The hospital hallway seemed colder than usual. The lights flickered and the smell of disinfectant was nauseating. In the file, she found something curious. Maintenance records signed by the same name, in different departments, always on the night shift. The name was Howard Lister, a maintenance technician. He had been at the hospital every day that coincided with Rachel and Megan's disappearances. Too much of a coincidence. Laura took the information to the sheriff, but he didn't even look at the paperwork. He simply said, "This man has worked here for 20 years, an exemplary citizen." Then he turned and left the room. It was then that she realized the system wasn't just failing. You were choosing to fail, choosing silence, convenience, blindness, because admitting something terrible was happening in Ashland would mean tarnishing the reputation of an entire town, and no one was willing to carry that burden. When she left the police station, the sky was grey, and the wind carried the scent of rain. Laura lit a cigarette and stood for a while watching the street, the sound of cars, people coming and going. Everything seemed normal, but there was a tension in the air, as if the city was aware something was wrong, and yet chose to pretend otherwise. Her phone vibrated, an unidentified message. "Stop looking. You won't like what you find." Laura read the sentence 3 times before putting her phone in her pocket. She didn't respond. She knew it was a warning, but it was also a confession. Someone was watching. Someone who knew exactly how far she'd gone. And yet, she didn't back down, because deep down, this wasn't just about Megan anymore. It was about all the silenced voices, all the affairs that ended in nothing. When he returned home that night, he found the front door slightly ajar. His heart raced. He entered slowly, his hand on his holster, the sound of his footsteps echoing across the hardwood floor. Everything seemed in its place, until he noticed the detail on the table. The same envelope that had disappeared now lay there intact. Inside was the scrap of Megan's uniform, still bearing the rust stain, and beside it, a folded piece of paper with a single handwritten sentence. "Some truths are not meant to be discovered." Laura sat up, took a deep breath, and looked out the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered intermittently, and she had the strange sensation of being watched. For the first time, she considered giving up, but something inside her, perhaps the same force that had driven Megan to fight, stopped her. Because now, more than ever, she knew she was close. Too close to something no one wanted to see come to light. And the fear she felt wasn't for herself anymore. It was for what she was about to discover. Laura Bennett no longer slept. The hours blurred together. The days felt like the same suffocating cycle of doubt, anger, and silence. That case was no longer just part of the job. It was something that stuck to her skin, that followed her even when she tried to shut it off. After the anonymous threat, the isolation became even more intense. The sheriff kept her out of the investigation, her colleagues pretended not to see, and the town, well, the town preferred to forget. It was as if Megan's disappearance had become a shadow no one wanted to face, a collective secret, too heavy to speak aloud. Laura, however, didn't know how to be part of that kind of silence. It was then that she decided to go it alone. She began revisiting the places the police had ignored. He returned to Highway 17, walked through the dry fields around the old factory, and spoke to residents who claimed to have heard screams but were never called to testify. Each person he met seemed to hold a piece of history, a distorted memory, a swallowed fear. A farmer said he'd seen a white car circling the area for weeks before Megan disappeared. A woman swore she'd seen a flashlight moving through the bushes in the early hours of the morning. No one could explain it properly, no one wanted to get involved, but little by little the fragments began to fit together. Laura wrote everything down in a worn notebook, the same one she'd carried since the first day of the case. It already contained coffee-stained pages, hurried scribbles, arrows, and connections. And at the center of those notes, one name kept coming back: Howard Lister, the hospital maintenance technician. The discreet man everyone described as too polite. The one who was always there when something went wrong, always helpful, always invisible. Laura had no proof, only instinct. But he'd learned, in all his years of research, that instinct is the first sign of truth. She began to follow him discreetly. She noted his schedule, his commute, the days he left the hospital late. Lister lived on the outskirts of Ashland, on a small rural property surrounded by trees. The house was old, with covered windows and a large barn next door. From a distance it looked like the kind of place where nothing ever happens, and perhaps that was why it was the perfect hiding place. One night, Laura stood in the car, watching the dim light coming from the front window. It was almost 2 in the morning and he was still awake. At one point, the light went out, and at that very moment she felt a chill crawl up the back of her neck, as if someone inside that house knew exactly where she was. The isolation began to take its toll. Laura was exhausted. Her nights were a whirlwind of memories, of theories that mingled with nightmares. Sometimes she dreamed of Megan, calling for help in a dark room, banging on the walls. Other times, she woke with her heart racing, with the feeling of being watched. She tried to maintain lucidity, but physical and emotional exhaustion was already leaving her vulnerable. Her husband, who had previously tried to understand, now avoided conversation. He said she was obsessed, that it would destroy her. And perhaps he was right, because at some point Laura stopped investigating a woman's disappearance and began fighting something much bigger: abandonment, neglect, cowardice. At the hospital, hostility escalated. Megan's colleagues began avoiding interviews. Documents disappeared. Recordings were erased. And the more doors closed, the closer Laura felt to the truth. But this closeness was accompanied by an almost physical loneliness. No one believed her anymore. The sheriff classified her as emotionally involved. Internal affairs temporarily suspended her, claiming she needed time to recover. Time, exactly what Megan didn't have. That week, Laura began to notice she was being followed. A dark car with no license plate would appear around corners, in her mirrors, in the shadows. One time she found a note under the car's wiper with 3 handwritten words. "Stop digging." The handwriting was firm, almost too careful. She stared at the note for long minutes before crumpling it up and throwing it away. Too late. She couldn't stop. One night it was raining heavily. Laura was driving along Route 17, the same one where Megan was last seen. The sound of rain hitting the roof of the car mixed with the whir of the wipers, creating a hypnotic rhythm. Suddenly, something glinted in the middle of the road, a piece of glass reflecting her headlights. She stopped, got out with her flashlight in hand, and bending down, saw marks in the mud, fresh small footprints, as if someone had walked barefoot through the mud. Her heart raced. She followed the footprints for a few meters until they simply stopped, as if the person had disappeared there, in the middle of nowhere. Wet and shivering, she looked around and realized she wasn't alone. She thought she heard light footsteps behind her, but when she turned, no one was there. She ran back to her car, her hands trembling, and sped back to town. From that night on, she began to have the constant feeling of being watched. At home, lights flickered for no reason. The television turned on by itself. Sometimes the phone rang, and when she answered, there was only the sound of breathing on the other end. Her body began to react to her fear. Headaches, insomnia, rapid heartbeat. Sanity seemed to slowly dissolve. But no matter how much her mind begged for rest, her police instinct wouldn't let her. She knew Megan was alive. She couldn't explain how, but she could feel it. Something inside her told her there was still time, and that stopping now would be the same as signing the girl's sentence. So Laura began doing what no other police officer had done, investigating outside the system. She entered properties without a warrant, hacked into confidential files, and exchanged information with journalists and even retired detectives. She became a kind of shadow, and ironically, this brought her even closer to what she was pursuing. Fear was no longer the enemy. The enemy was time. But there was a fine line between persistence and self-destruction, and Laura was about to cross it. One early morning, she found her car's mirror broken and the word "guilty" written on the bodywork in red paint. No one saw a thing. No one heard a thing. She wiped the glass with her bare hands, staring at the distorted reflection of her weary face, and murmured, "They know I'm close." And it was. Because that very week, something would happen in Ashland that would change everything. Something that would make it clear that Megan's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of something much darker, and Laura was about to discover just how much it would cost her. Howard Lister was the kind of man no one quite remembered. He worked quietly, spoke softly, and seemed to fit perfectly into that normal person profile small towns like to protect. In his early 50s, with thinning hair, clean clothes, and a polite smile. He'd lived alone since his wife died, or so he said, and spent most of his time at the hospital, fixing everything no one else wanted to fix. Stuck doors, flickering lights, hidden leaks. He seemed harmless, and perhaps that was exactly what made him dangerous. Laura began observing him closely, after noticing a pattern in the maintenance logs. He was always in the same areas where the victims had worked before they disappeared. He was like a silent shadow, present in all the right places at the right time, but leaving nothing that could incriminate him. When she first met him, in the hospital hallway, she had a strange feeling. He didn't seem startled, didn't show any discomfort. On the contrary, he smiled as if he already knew who she was. "You're the new detective, aren't you? It must be hard to believe bad things happen in a place like this." His voice was calm, almost sweet, but his eyes held something she couldn't quite define. They were cold, too fixed, as if they were watching her from within. He spoke slowly, choosing his words, and had that kind of calculated friendliness that, at first, seems genuine. He told her he knew Megan, that she was polite but distracted. He said it with a slight smile, but Laura noticed the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth when he mentioned her name. It was a quick, involuntary, almost imperceptible movement. A slip, and that small detail made her blood run cold. There was something about this man that didn't quite fit. Over the next few days, she began to discreetly follow him. Howard always left the hospital at the same time, but he never went straight home. He took long detours, stopped on deserted streets, and stared at houses for minutes before continuing on his way. One night, Laura saw him park near a vacant lot and get out of the car with a flashlight. He stood there staring into the darkness, as if admiring something no one else could see. Then he simply returned, as if nothing had happened. She began gathering evidence, schedules, routes, testimonies. She discovered that Lister had worked at 2 other hospitals before moving to Ashland. Both had unsolved missing persons records. In the old files, Laura found something no one else had looked for: a harassment complaint against him, dismissed for lack of evidence. The woman who reported him disappeared months later. The similarity to Megan's case was disturbing, but at the same time everything she had was circumstantial. No physical evidence, no evidence. The kind of situation police love to ignore. And the more she dug, the more she realized how careful Lister was. He never left a trail, never did anything strange enough to warrant a search. It was as if he knew exactly how far he could go without being caught. Laura began to wonder who Howard Lister really was. There were no childhood records, no old photos, no close relatives. The name first appeared in a document from 1983 when he was hired by a hospital in Indiana. Before that, nothing. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. She tried to access federal data, but found unusual restrictions: missing documents, locked files. This made her think of something she didn't want to admit. Maybe Howard wasn't even his real name. What intrigued her most was his behavior at the hospital. He seemed to know when she was near, as if he had a sixth sense. Once Laura was watching him from afar in the parking lot, and he simply turned his head, looked straight at her, and waved. A small, calm gesture, but it completely unhinged her. It wasn't overt provocation. It was something worse. It was control. He knew she was watching him and made it clear he didn't care. Over time, Laura began to see through the manipulation. People liked Howard. The nurses praised him, the doctors trusted him, the sheriff called him an old friend. He had an invisible network of influence built on sympathy, favors, and silence, and no one wanted to believe that this kind man could be hiding something monstrous. It was easier to believe that Megan had run away, that Rachel had given up on her life, than to admit that there was a predator among them. But her instincts were right, and Howard's gaze, that almost theatrical calm, only reinforced what her whole body was already screaming. He knew. He knew everything. He knew what she was discovering. He knew how far she would go, and maybe he even knew how to stop her. That night, Laura left the hospital with her head spinning. It was raining lightly, and the streetlights flickered. She got into her car, closed the door, and took a deep breath. In the rearview mirror, she saw the reflection of the second-story window, and there he was, standing still, watching. No sudden movements, no sign of haste, just that same fixed, cold, self-assured gaze. She swallowed hard and started the car, trying to ignore the shiver that was crawling up the back of her neck. As the car drove away, an uneasy feeling began to grow inside her. Something told her that Lister wasn't just the suspect. He was the kind of man who planned every detail, who turned normality into disguise, who made evil seem routine. And for the first time since the investigation began, Laura had the distinct impression that the hunt had just changed sides. Because perhaps, while she was following Howard Lister, he was the one who all along had been following her. It was on a grey afternoon with a heavy sky and the smell of rain that Megan's case took an even darker turn. Laura was reviewing old reports, trying to find some loophole she could use against Howard Lister, when the phone rang. The call came with a different urgency, the kind of tone the mind recognizes before it even understands the words. Another girl's missing. The operator's voice was dry, almost emotionless, but Laura felt her entire body freeze. For a moment she thought she'd heard wrong, but no, it was real. The new victim's name was Emily Rhodes, 21 years old, nursing student, and daughter of Linda Rhodes, a veteran nurse at St. Mary's Hospital and a close friend of Megan Carter. The disappearance happened in an identical fashion. Car abandoned on the side of the road, headlights on, engine still hot. Same stretch of Highway 17. The same suffocating silence all around. It was as if someone were deliberately repeating the crime, clearly intending to send a message. When Laura arrived at the scene, the smell of gasoline and wet earth mingled with the wind. There were tire tracks on the ground, but the rain was already beginning to erase them. The police cordoned off the area, but to Laura, it all felt like theater. The same questions, the same empty answers. Sheriff Douglas watched from afar, under a black umbrella, speaking quietly to two local reporters. She approached, still out. of breath, and asked if they'd looked up Lister's name on the previous night's shift roster. He looked away and replied lamely, "There's no reason for that." It was at that moment that Laura realized she was alone, completely alone. Suddenly, the sound of crying cut through the rain. It was Linda, Emily's mother, kneeling beside her daughter's car. Her hands were shaking, her eyes were red, and her entire body felt like it was about to collapse. Laura knelt with her, trying to say something meaningful, but the words just wouldn't come. Linda grabbed her wrist and whispered desperately, "You have to find her, the same way you should have found Megan." The sentence hit her like a blow. The guilt Laura had been pushing down came flooding back. She knew it wasn't a coincidence. Emily was the personal blow every predator uses to mark their territory, a direct, cruel message designed to destabilize. Howard Lister knew exactly what he was doing. He'd chosen the daughter of a friend of Megan's, someone emotionally connected to the previous case, someone who would force Laura to act on impulse. And it worked. She lost her temper. She felt anger rise like wildfire, burning away any remaining prudence. That night, Laura drove to Lister's house. She parked the car far away, turned off the headlights, and watched. The place was dark, with only a faint light coming from the barn. She stood there for almost an hour, trying to decide what to do. Her instincts screamed to go in, to get this over with. But reason whispered that she still had no proof, and worst of all, if she entered without a warrant, she risked losing everything she had gained. Still, something bothered her. In the air, that same dense silence of the road. A dog barked in the distance, and for a second she swore she saw a shadow moving near the fence. She returned home filled with a mixture of anger and fear. She threw her coat on the sofa, grabbed the nearest glass, and threw it at the wall. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the apartment. Amidst the shards, she saw her own reflection and realized how much she was transforming. The deep circles under her eyes, the tense gaze, the physical and emotional exhaustion. Everything about her screamed fatigue, but her stubborn heart persisted. She couldn't stop now. Over the next few days, she immersed herself completely in Emily's case. She combed through every hospital record, compared schedules, examined security cameras, and cross-referenced the names of patients and staff. And once again, there he was, Howard Lister on duty the 2 nights before the disappearance. When Laura brought this information to the sheriff, he simply laughed. "Bennett, you need to rest. You're seeing patterns where there aren't any." She responded in a firm, almost threatening tone, "And you're choosing not to." Back in her office, Laura looked at the whiteboard covered in photos and dates. In the center, she wrote in red pen, "He's kidding." US. And for the first time since the beginning, fear gave way to a grim certainty. Howard wasn't running, he was leading. Every clue, every coincidence, every disappearance seemed calculated to lead her where he wanted. And somehow, she sensed his next move would be even crueler. The next morning, while reviewing footage from cameras near the hospital, something caught his eye. In one of the recordings, a shadow walked across the parking lot shortly after Emily was last seen. His face was invisible, but the way he walked, the way he moved his shoulders, the way he carried himself, it was him, Howard Lister. The timestamp on the recording showed 10:47 p.m., almost the same time Emily's car was found. Laura pressed play repeatedly, trying to get a better look, but the image was distorted by the rain. Still, her heart knew. She didn't need technical confirmation. It was him, and for the first time, she felt not just fear, but real, close, palpable danger. Because if Lister was repeating the pattern, if he was truly following the logic she imagined, then there was something he would do again. A small but vital detail that connected all the disappearances, and Laura, trembling, knew she had to find him before it was too late. The next morning dawned heavy, grey with the kind of fog that makes the city seem suspended in time. Laura had barely slept. She'd spent the night awake, her face illuminated by the computer screen and dozens of notes scattered across the table. Every cold coffee, every scribbled page, every stare at the camera feeds was another step toward an abyss she could no longer avoid. Emily Rhodes had been missing for 48 hours, and she knew, instinctively, viscerally, that the clock was ticking against her life. When the phone rang at 7 in the morning, Laura was ready. It was Sergeant Miller, the only one in the force who still took her seriously. He said they'd found a woman's footprint behind the gas station on Route 17, small, barefoot, and covered in mud. Laura sped off, her heart pounding as if trying to warn her that what she was about to see would change everything. The spot was the same stretch where Megan had disappeared 2 months earlier. The previous night's rain had turned the road into a muddy puddle, but the footprint was there, clear, deep, as if someone had run, as if they were running away. She bent down, ran her fingers over the mark, and the feeling was immediate. Fear. Not ordinary fear, but the kind that smells. Sounds makes your entire body freeze. The younger officer commented that maybe it was just a lost hiker. Laura looked up and replied dryly, "Nobody walks barefoot around here at night." Back in the car, she opened the map of the area. Highway 17 ran near a densely wooded area, a forgotten territory between the old farms and the Blackstone River. Few people had gone there since the paper mill closed. She enlarged the map and noticed something. Howard Lister's property was only 4 kilometers. From that spot, 4 kilometers. It was too close to be a coincidence. Her brain began to work quickly, connecting loose ends, plotting routes, comparing schedules. Everything pointed to that place. During the afternoon, Laura accessed the area's energy records. She discovered that, even though Lister's main house was declared sparsely inhabited, there was constant consumption in one of the smaller buildings in the back, something like a cabin or a storage room. Continuous power, even at E. Unusual hours. The light stayed on all night. It didn't make sense. And it's always what doesn't make sense that points the way. No warrant, no backup, no one. It was the kind of moment a normal investigator would back down. But Laura was never normal. She got into her car, strapped her gun to her waist, and drove down Route 17. The sky was beginning to darken, the wind was creaking through the trees, and the sound of tires on wet asphalt was the only constant sound. Her cell phone read 10:18 p.m. when she spotted in the distance the iron gate to Lister's property. She stopped the car and got out slowly, flashlight in hand. The lock was open. The scraping sound of the iron echoed like a scream across the field. The air there seemed colder, heavier. Laura followed the dirt path that led to the barn, taking in every detail. The place was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was something new, fresh footprints, varying in size, coming and going. On the ground, a wheelbarrow tire, track, and the smell, a strong chemical smell mixed with mold and rust. Inside, it was nearly pitch black. Laura turned on her flashlight and saw hanging tools, chains, and piles of scrap wood. She shone the light along the walls, and for a second thought she was mistaken. But then she saw it. A stain. Something dripping from one of the boards, a thin, dry, dark line. Blood. Her breath caught, and right next to it, a small piece of hospital-style tape stuck to the floor. On it, 2 initials, written in pen, E.R.E. Emily Rhodes. Laura's heart raced. It was the first concrete evidence since the case began. She grabbed her phone to take pictures, but it froze. No signal, no sound, other than her own breathing. And that's when she heard it. Faint, distant, coming from under her feet. A dry, repeated, intermittent sound. 3 short beats. Silence. 3 long beats. Silence. 3 short beats again. She froze. It was a cry for help. He knelt, pressed his ear to the floor, and heard the sound. Vibrate beneath the boards. Someone was down there. With shaking hands, he began moving boxes, pushing barrels, until he found a small trap door hidden under a tarp. He tried to open it, but the padlock was rusty and firm. "Calm down, I'm here," he murmured, his voice trembling. He picked up an iron bar and began striking the padlock, the sound echoing through the warehouse. Each strike was a mixture of desperation and hope, until the iron gave way and the lid opened with a sharp snap. A blast of cold air rose from the basement, carrying a smell of mildew, rust, and something else. The smell of someone who'd lived too long without seeing the light. Laura shone her light into the hole, but could see nothing but pitch-black darkness. She tried to climb down, but the sound of an engine in the distance made her stop. Headlights. Someone was coming. Her entire body reacted. She turned off the flashlight, switched off her phone, and leaned against the wall, trying to control her breathing. A car stopped outside, the sound of the door slamming shut. Slow, steady footsteps echoed across the dirt floor. Laura gripped the gun and kept her eyes fixed on the warehouse entrance. The door creaked open slowly. Moonlight flooded the space, revealing a tall, motionless silhouette. Howard Lister. He stood still for a moment as if sniffing the air. Then he stepped inside, his gaze calmly scanning the room until it settled exactly where she was hiding. Laura felt her entire body stiffen. One wrong move and it would all be over. But Howard didn't come closer. Instead, he smiled. A small, cold smile, like someone who knew more than he should. "I knew you'd come, Detective," he said softly, almost a whisper. "You're just like her. Too curious." He turned off the flashlight and left, the sound of his footsteps fading away. Laura waited a minute, then another. When she was finally convinced he was gone, she turned on the flashlight again and peered into the trap door. The knocking had stopped. Only silence remained, and in that silence she knew. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Because down there, in that suffocating darkness, someone was waiting. And maybe they were still alive. That night seemed longer than any other. The wind beat against the barn windows, making the boards creak as if the place itself were breathing. Laura still knelt before the trapdoor, her heart hammering in her chest, her entire body on alert. The darkness of the basement seemed to swallow. The lantern's light and the air rising from it was damp, cold, with a strong smell of rust and something reminiscent of old blood. She called softly, "Is anyone there?" But the silence answered first. Then a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the void. 3 faint-spaced knocks coming from somewhere below. 3 knocks, stop, 3 again. It was the same pattern. SOS. The same cry for help a child had heard days before, without understanding its meaning. Laura swallowed her fear and began descending. The wooden stairs creaked with each step, and the light flickered on the dirty walls, revealing fragments of objects she didn't want to recognize. When her feet touched the floor, the cold became almost unbearable. The basement was cramped, windowless, the ceiling low, and the thin air burned her lungs. She advanced slowly, shining her light into the far corner, and it was there that she saw it, a form covered by a sheet, breathing shallowly, its thin body trembling beneath the fabric. Laura ran and carefully pulled the blanket away. The pale face, the dirty hair, the cracked lips. It was Megan Carter. Viva. For a moment, time stood still. Laura's body froze. Her breath caught in her chest. Megan was alive, but she could barely open her eyes. Her skin was marred with wounds, her hands trembled, her wrists bearing the marks of chains. "It's okay, Megan. I'm here. I came to get you out of here," Laura whispered, fighting back tears. But Megan shook her head, her eyes frightened, her hoarse voice escaping in a thread of sound. "He's still here." Laura felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The flashlight trembled in her hand. The phrase echoed in her head like a siren. "He's still here." The echo repeated, bouncing against the narrow walls. She grabbed Megan by the shoulders, trying to hold her steady, and looked around. She needed to get her out of there, but the sound of footsteps came first. Slow, shuffling, climbing the wooden stairs. A creak, another, and another. Laura's heart raced so fast it felt like it would burst. She turned off the flashlight, pulled out her gun, and stood still, holding Megan's weak body with one hand. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. Silence. The next sound was the padlock being replaced. Howard Lister had just locked the trapdoor. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot. He knew she was inside. Laura looked around desperately, searching for another way out. There was a small ventilation shaft near the ceiling, narrow but wide enough for someone thin to fit through. She lifted Megan with effort, pushing her body toward the hole. "Come on, Megan, you have to get out. I'll stay behind you." The girl resisted, her body too weak, but Laura insisted. "Now go." Upstairs, footsteps began moving again, slowly. Howard paced the barn, the sound of his boots hitting the ground, his pace calm, controlled. Laura sensed he was savoring the moment. Then the sound stopped, and for a brief moment, silence returned, until something metallic scraped, the sound of a bucket being dragged, perhaps a tool. He was waiting. The game somehow had already begun. Laura helped Megan reach the shaft exit and climbed in behind. Her hands ached, her entire body trembled, but adrenaline pushed them forward. They managed to climb out of the basement behind the barn, rolling in the cold mud. The moon illuminated the open field, and in the distance, the sound of a car engine. Lister. He was coming. Back. Laura pulled Megan by the arms, trying to drag her to the fence. "Hang on, just a little longer," she said, unsure whether to Megan or herself. Suddenly, a headlight came on, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Lister's car was coming fast, its tires kicking up mud and rocks. Laura pulled her gun and shot the left headlight. The window shattered, and the car skidded, narrowly avoiding it. Megan screamed, and Laura pushed her behind a pile of hay. The sound of footsteps followed soon. After, Lister calmly got out of the car, flashlight in hand and a smile that didn't match the situation. "You know, Detective," he said, his voice calm, almost polite, "some people are born to see the dark. Others, to be trapped in it." Laura kept the gun pointed, her finger firm on the trigger. "It's over, Howard. She's alive, and you'll pay for every single one of them." He took a step forward, the flashlight beam reflecting in his eyes, and for a moment she saw, not the polite man from the hospital, but something beyond that. A void, a kind of feelingless evil. Then he stepped forward. The shot echoed across the field, loud and dry, shattering the silence of the night. Lister fell to his knees, the flashlight rolling across the ground and going out in the mud. Laura ran to Megan, trying to keep her conscious. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Someone had heard the shot. "You're safe now," she whispered, holding her hand tightly. Megan looked at her, her eyes welling, and whispered, almost voiceless, "I never stopped beating." That was when Laura understood. The beating, the sound the child had heard days before. It was her. Megan was trying to let the world know she was still alive. As the red and blue lights of the vehicles filled the field, Laura took a deep breath for the first time in days. The trapdoor was broken, and rescue teams descended into the basement. There they found more than they had imagined: clothes, photos, personal belongings of other missing women. It was the end of a cycle that had lasted years. Howard Lister was dead, and Megan Carter, against all odds, was alive. But as the paramedics carried her to the ambulance, Laura looked at the dark barn and felt a chill, because deep down, something told her this place still held secrets. Secrets that perhaps should never see the light. Dawn in Ashland felt different that morning. The sun rose timidly, almost shyly, trying to pierce the thick fog that blanketed the fields. After months of searching, tension, and fear, the silence that settled in now was different. The silence that comes after a storm, when the world seems to slowly come back together. Laura leaned against the hood of the police car, watching the ambulance taking Megan to the hospital. The girl was breathing, alive, but her lost gaze, her empty expression showed that part of her was still trapped in that windowless room. It was a kind of survival that couldn't be put into words. Megan had escaped captivity, but the darkness still lived within her. The officers moved through the grounds like ghosts, collecting evidence, photographing, measuring, trying to shape something no one could fully understand. Howard Lister's body lay near the barn, covered by a grey tarp. Laura looked at him one last time, trying to find some trace of humanity. But there was none. Only absolute emptiness remained, the same emptiness she had felt every time she saw his eyes. And, in a strange way, his face now seemed at peace. Perhaps because monsters, when finally unmasked, no longer need to pretend to be human. She lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and tasted the bitter nicotine mixed with the mud and dry rain in the air. Miller approached, still panting, and said, "You did it. She's alive." Laura nodded but didn't respond. What should have been a victory felt more like a burden. Part of her wanted to celebrate, and part of her just wanted to sleep for a whole week. But sleep never came easily after something like this. Her body rested, but her mind remained trapped inside in the basement, listening to the pounding, smelling the rust. When day finally broke, St. Mary's Hospital became the center of attention. Journalists, onlookers, cameras, questions from all sides. Everyone wanted to see the girl who survived. Everyone wanted to understand how a woman could have been kept alive, hidden for so long without anyone noticing. And amidst the questions and the flashes, there she was, Megan Carter, pale, wrapped in blankets, her gaze fixed on a spot no one else could see. Laura stood in the doorway, watching from a distance, not daring to approach. Hours later, in the room, Megan asked to see her. Laura entered slowly, unsure of what to say. The sound of machines was constant, and the hospital smell brought back memories she wanted to forget. Megan looked at her with a tired half-smile. "I thought I'd never see the light again." Laura pulled up a chair, sat beside the bed and replied, "You were stronger than all of us." Megan held her hand, her voice trembling. "I banged on the walls every day. I thought no one would hear." Her words came out slowly, but they carried truth. But someone did, didn't they? Laura squeezed her hand back and felt a lump rise in her throat. "Yes, you did. A child did. And that's what saved you." Megan closed her eyes, a tear escaping, and smiled faintly. "So there's still hope," she whispered. For a few seconds Laura was silent, watching the girl's face. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that horror could end in hope, but she knew it wasn't always that way. When she left the hospital, the city seemed to be picking up again. Children were playing in the streets again, and local newspapers were splashing headlines with words like heroine, survivor, and end of terror in Ashland. But for Laura, the end was never the end. She knew that every solved case left scars, not just on the victims, but on those who sought them out. Sometimes the scars didn't stay on the body, they stayed in the eyes, and hers from that day on would never be the same. In the following days, Laura was summoned by the press, praised by her superiors, treated as a symbol of courage. But none of that mattered. When the noise of the interviews died down and she returned home, the silence was deafening. At night, she dreamed of the basement, of the knocking, of his footsteps upstairs. She woke sweating, her heart racing, and for a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. The fear took a long time to go away, because fear sometimes is what remains when everything is over. One afternoon, while organizing the final reports, Laura received a letter with no return address. Inside was just a yellowed sheet of paper with a handwritten sentence. "Some places never stop calling to those who have been there. No name, no signature. The kind of thing that makes your skin crawl, even for no apparent reason." She folded the paper and put it away, in the drawer, trying to convince herself it was just a joke. But deep down, a voice insisted. Something about this story wasn't completely over yet. That night, as she drove along Route 17, Laura slowed down. The surrounding countryside was silent, the trees swaying in the cold wind. She glanced at the spot where Megan's car had been found months earlier. The headlights illuminated the asphalt for a few seconds, then faded as she turned off the engine. She stood there, listening to the distant sound of crickets and her heart beating slowly. The case was solved, the criminal dead, the victim safe. But for some reason, the road still felt alive, as if it held its own memories, secrets she preferred not to share. And it was there, amid that unsettling silence, that Laura understood. Some stories end with rescue, with reunion, with relief, but there are others that continue, even after the end, because evil sometimes doesn't die with the perpetrator. It stays, it spreads, and somehow it breathes again when the wind blows the same way it did that night, hot, stuffy, and full of things no one wants to remember. Months passed, but Ashland was never the same. People still walked the streets, storefronts still lit up at dusk, and the sound of cicadas still filled the summer nights. But there was something different in the air, a quiet, almost imperceptible tension that hung over everything. The town that once prided itself on its calm now bore the mark of an ancient fear, the kind that creeps in slowly, in whispered conversations and glances that avoid the subject. No one wanted to talk about what happened, but everyone knew, and everyone deep down feared what might still be lurking somewhere. Megan Carter was slowly recovering. Physically, her wounds were healing, but the others, the invisible ones, still hurt. She tried to get her life back on track, attending therapy sessions and giving short interviews about overcoming grief. But when the cameras went dark, silence returned. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night with her heart racing, certain she was still in that windowless room, hearing the sound of the padlock clicking shut. Other times, she would stand for long minutes in front of the window, watching the street as if fearing something might happen again. Time healed slowly, as if I were afraid to touch the memories. Laura Bennett, on the other hand, had become a respected figure. Her name graced headlines, her face appeared in news reports and documentaries. People called her a hero, but she didn't see herself that way. She knew heroism was just the world's way of making sense of other people's trauma. Inside her, the case was still an open wound. The images, the sounds, the smells. It all came back in the early mornings when sleep wouldn't come. Howard Lister's body, Megan's empty gaze, the sound of the knocking. None of it really went away. Over time, Laura asked for a break. He said he needed rest, but deep down it was something else. He needed silence, distance, oblivion. He bought a small house in the countryside, surrounded by trees and overlooking a lake. There the days were slow, and the only constant sound was that of birds. He tried to read, tend to the plants, resume a simple routine. But sometimes at dusk, the wind would blow in a way that brought back memories. And she still heard it. 3 short beats, 3 long beats, 3 short beats. The distant echo of something that never truly ends. 1 day months later, Laura received an unexpected visitor. It was Megan. She held flowers in her hands and had a calm, almost serene look in her eyes. They talked for hours on the porch, like old acquaintances. Megan told her she had moved, that she had started school again, that she was trying to leave the past behind. Laura smiled proudly, but noticed a detail she had initially missed. Megan was wearing a small silver bracelet made of 3 linked rings. When asked what it meant, the young woman replied, "They're beats. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. So you never forget that someone heard it." The silence that followed was dense, beautiful, almost sacred. Laura held her cup in both hands, gazing at the reflection of the lake. The breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment everything seemed peaceful. But peace, she knew, is a fragile thing. Sometimes it only lasts until the next memory. Megan said goodbye with a long hug, and before leaving she turned and said, "You know what's strange? Sometimes I still dream about that place. And in my dreams I'm not alone." Laura tried to smile, but her heart sank. She watched the car drive away down the dirt road until it disappeared into the trees. She stood there, watching the horizon as the sun slowly set. The oranges and reds reflected on the water, and for a moment everything seemed to return to normal, until a faint sound, coming from somewhere in the distance, broke the silence. 3 dry, spaced, almost imperceptible knocks. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe just the echo of memory. But somewhere deep inside, Laura knew that some stories don't end. They just change shape, waiting for the right moment to begin again. And when the wind blows just right, when the world grows quiet enough to listen again, you could swear you could still hear the sound. Faint, insistent, coming from far away. 3 short beats, 3 long beats, 3 short beats. As if someone, somewhere, was still asking to be found. Stories like Megan and Laura's remind us why some cases aren't just crimes. They're open wounds that show how powerful the truth can be when someone has the courage to seek it. If this video made your heart race, if it gave you that feeling of being inside the story, then it did what it needed to. Connect you with something real. Now that same impact can reach more people. Just let the like and press subscribe so that this story continues to echo, so that more people feel the same chills that you felt here. Write the word in the comments "true" to show that you also believe that no voice should be trapped in silence. And stick around, because the next video brings an even more intriguing case, a disappearance that seemed impossible until the day a forgotten detail revealed everything. You'll want to see it.